A house on a lake in central New York. Late August. 98 years of weather standing on cedar shingles turned silver at the seams. A pencil line, drawn on a map, folded into thirds, slipped into the front pocket of a pair of jeans 2 months before anyone knew what it meant. Inside a lawyer's office, a woman opens her purse. Across the table, a man in an expensive shirt stops looking satisfied. 6 weeks earlier, a grandmother had been found in her chair with her tea beside her still warm. She had been reading a notebook. 11 notebooks. Weather, water. Where the storm would come from, and which stone in the path would move first. Every one of them addressed to you. Outside the lawyer's office, hydrangeas going leggy in the porch light. Down the hill, a boat hole roof waiting in the pines. Somewhere on a shore path, a sign about to come down. And a young woman about to learn what she has been chosen for. The phone rang at 3:14 in the afternoon, and Rosalind Halberstam was weighing pea seeds, small ones, the kind that fit 20 to a gram if you had a steady hand. She had a steady hand. 4 years of undergraduate botany and a research assistantship at the Cornell Agricultural Annex had trained her fingers to do things her heart could not, which was useful. Because when the phone rang the second time and she saw the name on the screen, Winifred Bly, she already knew. She set the tweezers down, slow, because Winifred did not call. Winifred sent postcards from the little bookshop she ran 3 streets from the lake. One every equinox, always the same brand with the watercolor of the cedar dock. Winifred sent birthday cards 2 weeks late with folded dollar bills inside the way old women who remembered the Depression still did. Winifred did not pick up a phone and call unless someone had died. Roz picked up the phone. The word sweetheart came through the line, and that was the whole sentence. Because sweetheart from Winifred always meant sit down. Rose did not sit down. She stood at the lab counter with the pea seeds glinting under fluorescent light, and she listened to the woman on the other end deliver the words that had been rehearsed on the drive to town, and she watched her own hand curl around the edge of the counter until her knuckles turned the color of the seeds. The details arrived in short pieces. This morning, in her chair. Halver found her at the noon check. She was sitting with her tea. Already gone, honey. It was quiet. Quiet. As if that word could hold anything. Roz thanked her. Because that was what you were supposed to do. You thanked the woman who had loved your grandmother for 40 years and who had just driven to a payphone at the marina. Winifred did not trust cell service near the lake, never had to tell you that the last person on earth who had raised you was dead in a chair with her tea beside her. Then Roz walked to the sink, washed her hands, twice, ran the water hot enough to hurt because if her hands hurt, the rest of her would follow orders. She locked up the seed trays, told her supervisor she needed the week, maybe 2, maybe more, then she drove. 6 hours from Ithaca to the lake was the drive she had made every summer since she was 11 years old back when a state trooper had come to her school in a rain-dark uniform and told the principal something the principal had refused to say out loud. The plane her parents had taken to a wedding in the Adirondacks had come down in weather nobody had forecast. And Nadine Halberstam had driven the same 6 hours in reverse to collect a girl she had met exactly twice, because Roz's mother had been Nadine's daughter, and Nadine's daughter had married a man Nadine's sons did not like, and the family had folded itself around that grievance the way families do. Nadine had driven up in a station wagon that smelled of cedar sawdust and dog. She had taken Roz's small pink suitcase out of the principal's hands without asking permission. And she had made a promise in exactly one sentence, the only sentence Roz remembered from that whole white-washed-out afternoon, a promise to bring her home and figure the rest out later. That had been 13 years ago. Now Roz drove the same route, Route 28 through the pines, the lake showing itself in pieces between the trunks the way it always did, like something the road kept forgetting and then remembering. She passed the little diner where Nadine had bought her a grilled cheese sandwich the size of a paperback book the first summer she came. She passed the marina where Winifred kept her landline. She passed the sign that said Otsego Lake 3 miles with paint flaking off the bottom corner where the sign had stood in the same weather for maybe 20 years. She did not cry. She had a rule about that. Because crying while driving was how people died on Route 28, and she was not going to add anyone to the list of people who died on the way to something they could not fix. She arrived at 7:40. The lawyer's meeting was scheduled for 7, which meant she was 40 minutes late, which meant the meeting had almost certainly started without her because Ellsworth Halberstam did not wait for anyone, and Ellsworth Halberstam was the elder son. She parked in the gravel lot beside the offices of Marchetti and Bell. The building was a converted Victorian painted the color of old butter with hydrangeas going leggy along the porch rail. The porch light was on because the sun was already low over the lake. Roz sat in her car for one long minute. She looked at herself in the rearview mirror. 24 years old, dark hair pulled back, a small red mark on her chin where she had cut herself trimming a fingernail on the drive down, biting the edge off the way she used to when she was 13. Her grandmother had always told her to stop that. "Your hands are going to feed you someday," Nadine used to say. "Don't chew them." Roz took her hands off the wheel. Then she went inside. Inez Marchetti met her at the door. Inez was tall and gray-eyed and moved like a woman who had spent her whole life being told to smile more and had decided somewhere in her 40s that she was done complying. She hugged Roz once briefly the way she probably hugged widows. She murmured that the others had been in there 20 minutes but that she had made them wait for the will itself. She added that they were not at present being pleasant, and Roz, without changing her expression, offered that they were not usually pleasant. Inez gave her the kind of look that was not quite a smile, but had the shape of one, and led her down the hallway. The conference room door was closed. Behind it, Roz could hear Ellsworth's voice, the low banker voice he used when he was explaining something to a woman he assumed had never balanced a checkbook, which was almost every woman. Inez opened the door. The room fell quiet the way a room falls quiet when everyone in it has been talking about you. Ellsworth sat at the head of the table because he always sat at the head of the table. 54 years old, silver at the temples. The kind of shirt that was expensive because it did not look expensive. Odette sat to his right in a cream-colored blazer, her phone face down, beside a leather folio, her lipstick reapplied recently enough that Roz could smell it. Thaddeus sat opposite 49 in a corduroy jacket that had probably been fashionable in 1997 and was in fairness cycling back around. His daughter Beatrix sat beside him. 16, legs crossed, a denim jacket covered in enamel pins. She was the only person in the room who looked at Roz first. Thaddeus got halfway up out of his chair, then sat back down because Ellsworth had not risen and standing alone would have made Thaddeus look like he was overreaching, which he was in a small way and knew it and hated himself for knowing it. All of that showed on his face in the space of about a second and a half. Trix caught it, so did Roz. Odette produced a warmth about the drive being brutal in the poor girl and offered a sentence about how they should have offered the plane. Ellsworth did not have a plane. Ellsworth had a friend with a plane occasionally, but the sentence still went into the air of the room and floated there doing what Odette needed it to do, which was establish that the Halberstams who had lake houses were the kind of Halberstams who thought about planes. Inez sat down. Inez put a folder on the table. Inez suggested mildly that they begin. Roz sat. Trix pushed a mint across the table to her without looking the way you would to somebody sneaking into church late. Roz took it. Inez read the will. Nadine Halberstam, born 1955 of Cooperstown, New York, being of sound mind, made and executed this last will and testament in the presence of witnesses on the 12th of September of the previous year. To her elder son Ellsworth, she left the West Lake House. To her younger son Thaddeus, she left the East Lake House. To her granddaughter Rosalind, she left the caretaker's cottage, the shore path, and Inez paused half a breath because she was a good lawyer, and she wanted them to hear it. The land parcel behind the cottage running to the old birch at the property line. Rose did not react. She had been raised by Nadine, and Nadine had never once reacted to anything in public. Ellsworth reacted, not visibly, but his hand resting flat on the table tightened by a degree. Odette caught it and covered his knuckles with her own hand in a gesture that looked affectionate and was in fact a warning. because Odette had sold enough houses to know the shape of a face that was about to argue. Thaddeus looked at the table. Trix was watching everything. Inez closed the reading with the smaller bequests. Winifred Bly would receive the reading chair and the fountain pens. Halvor Ames would receive the tool chest. Simone Duquette would receive a small annuity. Rosalind would receive the residuary, meaning the personal property in the cottage, the household effects, the sums remaining in her grandmother's savings account after burial expenses in the family Bible. Odette repeated the word Bible under her breath softly as if trying it out. Ellsworth cleared his throat and asked a question. He asked it carefully in the tone of a man who had spent an hour with a legal pad the night before. He said that the property had been divided informally 4 years ago, and that his mother and he had sat down and drawn a map, and that the parcel behind the cottage was understood to be a shared reserve, not any single beneficiaries. Inez said nothing, which is what a lawyer does when she wants the person talking to keep digging. Ellsworth kept digging. He asked, still careful, whether Inez had that map, the one with the pencil markings. Inez opened her folder. Slowly, she placed a single map on the table. The map was a photocopy. Roz could tell by the slight gray band along the right margin where the copier bulb had cast, but it was a photocopy of a map that showed the whole property, the 2 lake houses, the cottage, the shore, the winding path. The map had no pencil markings. The map had never had pencil markings, because the map on the table was the photocopy Ellsworth himself had submitted to Inez Marchetti's office 6 months earlier. On a visit Nadine had known nothing about, and Inez had accepted it into the file with a small note reading, supplied by beneficiary, no evidentiary weight. Ellsworth looked at it and looked satisfied. Roz opened her purse. She had driven 6 hours. She had cried exactly 0 tears. She had eaten a bag of pretzels at a gas station outside Norwich. And in the front pouch of her purse, folded into thirds, because Nadine had folded everything into thirds, was the original map. The original had a pencil line. The pencil line ran from the cottage along the shore, up through the pines, all the way to the old birch. It enclosed the parcel Inez had just read into the will. Nadine had mailed the map to Roz 2 months before she died, in a plain envelope with no note and with only 1 word written on the outside in her grandmother's flat chemistry teacher handwriting. Keep. Roz put the original on the table beside the photocopy. She did not speak. Neither did anyone else, because there was nothing to say. The line was right there, in pencil, in Nadine's hand. Loop curve small waver at the birch, because Nadine had rested her wrist on the paper. Inez leaned over, looked, straightened up, turned to Ellsworth. She observed mildly that there was a pencil marking on the original and that it matched the parcel description in the will. Odette recovered fastest. She suggested that Nadine was always making notes on things that she marked up cookbooks and phone books, that this was probably no different. Inez noted in the same mild register that Nadine had in this instance marked up a will. Odette's smile did not waver, but her hand on Ellsworth's knuckles tightened, and this time it was not affectionate at all. Thaddeus finally spoke. He asked cautiously whether the pencil line had legal weight. Inez answered that the will's parcel description was clear on its own and that the pencil map was corroborating. She added without emphasis that corroborating was not a word she needed, but it was a word she had. Trix was watching her uncle. Trix was watching her father. Trix was watching her Aunt Odette, who had never told Trix she was welcome to call her aunt, and had instead once at a Christmas said just, "Odette is fine, honey." Trix had a face like a small, still lake, nothing moving on the surface. Underneath, something feeding. Rose took the original map back, folded it in thirds, put it in her purse. Then she looked across the table at Ellsworth and offered the most polite version of the sentence that existed in her, which was that she was sorry it had not been the map he was looking for. Ellsworth did not answer. Inez closed the folder and said she would draw up the transfers that week and that Roz should come by on Thursday to sign the deed. Roz nodded. The meeting ended without ending, which is how meetings end when the person who called them realizes they have lost the room and does not know how to leave with dignity. Ellsworth stood eventually. Odette stood. She said something warm and hollow about grief and about time and about how families found their way. Thaddeus lingered. Trix lingered longer. On the porch in the gathering blue of an August evening, Trix touched Roz's elbow and offered in a low voice an "Are you okay?" delivered as a statement that could be refused. Roz did not know yet. Trix offered a bed at their house tonight. Roz declined. Trix nodded, said figured, just checking, and walked to her father's car with her hands in her denim jacket pockets and her shoulders up around her ears. She looked back once at the cottage side of the property, invisible from here downhill and around the bend. She looked like she wanted to say something else and had decided it was not the night for it. Roz got in her own car. She drove the last mile alone. The cottage sat where it had always sat, halfway down the slope between the road and the lake, tucked in among the white pines, so that from the county landing you had to know exactly where to look to see the peak of its roof, which is exactly what Roz's great-grandfather, Otto Halberstam, had wanted back in 1928 when he built the thing. Because Otto Halberstam had not built a caretaker's cottage. Otto Halberstam had built a summer inn, a small one, 2 stories, cedar shingled, with a low-arched roof line that looked, if you squinted at it in a certain kind of dusk, like the hull of an upside-down boat. Otto had come from a coastal Norwegian family 2 generations back, and the low arch was the kind of roof his grandfather had built on fishing sheds along a fjord Otto himself had never seen. The upstairs was one long room with a half-round window that looked out over the lake. Downstairs was a sitting room, a narrow kitchen, and a bathroom Otto had added in 1934 because a paying guest had complained. Otto's summer inn had failed, which was fine, because by then Otto had built the 2 lake houses on the higher ground and had rented those out instead and had let his own son move into the failed inn to look after the property. The son had married. The son had raised 2 children in the failed inn. The son had died. His widow Nadine had raised her own children, partly in the inn and partly in the West House, depending on the season. Then in 1988, when Ellsworth had gone to college and Thaddeus was finishing high school, Nadine had made a quiet, permanent decision. She had moved back into the failed inn, alone. She had called it the cottage, and she had lived there for 36 years. Otto's ghost, if Otto's ghost existed, had probably approved. Roz pulled up to the little gravel pad above the cottage and cut her engine. The cottage sat below her gold in the last light. The low-arched roof, the half-round window, the narrow chimney with its cap of copper turned green as pond scum. The cedar shingles gone silver where the weather had eaten the stain off brown, where a shadow from the pines had preserved it. The whole small, strange building looking in that moment exactly the way it had looked the day Nadine had first opened the door for a soaked, dazed 11-year-old and offered her a sandwich. Rose did not go in. Not yet. She stood in the gravel with her keys in her hand and she listened. She heard the lake, water moving against the stone at the foot of the shore path. She heard a loon somewhere out toward the west shore, calling the way loons call in August, long, wavering, unhurried. She heard pine needles hushing above her. She heard the copper flag on the chimney tick as the wind moved it a quarter turn. She did not hear Nadine, which she had been half expecting, which was stupid, but grief does stupid things to the ear. Roz walked down to the cottage. She used the caretaker's door on the lakeside because that was the door Nadine had always used, and because using the front door tonight would have felt like walking into someone else's house. Inside, the smell hit her first. Cedar, old paper, the faint sweetness of the pine tar soap Nadine had used since Roz was a child. Underneath all of it, the faintest trace of the lavender hand cream. Winifred had probably brought over that morning and left on the sink beside the sad, still teacup. Roz did not go to the kitchen. She could not go to the kitchen. Not yet. She stood in the sitting room, which was by any honest measure packed. 3 generations of Halberstam indecision exactly the way it had always been. Otto's tool chest by the window, because Nadine had not wanted to move it and had not wanted to throw it out. A stack of winter blankets in a black garbage bag under the sofa. Two dining chairs upside down on top of the sofa. A watercolor of the lake face down against the wall because Nadine had never liked the painter had inherited the painting and had left it turned around for probably a decade rather than either display it or admit she disliked it. Everywhere the shape of a woman who had never thrown out a thing that might yet be useful and who had also refused to pretend that everything was. On the mantel, a small ceramic rooster, one wing missing. The other wing painted a startling shade of red because Ellsworth Halberstam, at 8 years old, had painted it in a pottery class at the County Rec Center in 1980, and Nadine had kept it on that mantel for 46 years. Roz picked it up, turned it in her hand, felt the weight of it, which was more than a rooster should weigh, because the boy who made it had used too much clay. Because grief does not arrive in a straight line, which Roz knew in her head from a psychology elective she had taken sophomore year. What she had not known until this moment was that grief could take the shape of a red-winged ceramic bird made by a man she did not particularly like, and that holding it could bring her closer to breaking down than the 6-hour drive had. She put the rooster back on the mantel, careful, facing the window, the way Nadine had always faced it because Nadine had said the rooster deserved a view. Then Roz sat on the edge of the sofa in the small, clear space between one dining chair leg and the black bag of blankets, and she let herself cry for exactly 2 minutes. Timed, because if you gave grief a schedule, sometimes grief kept it. At the end of the 2 minutes, she stood up, washed her face at the kitchen tap, filled the kettle, because if the woman who had raised you had been found dead in her chair with her tea beside her, then the correct response, the only response, was to make yourself a cup of your own. She slept upstairs that night in the long room with the half-round window. The bed was Nadine's. The sheets were fresh. Winifred had done that too, apparently, because Winifred did what needed doing and did not announce it. Rose lay under a thin summer blanket and watched the moon come up over the far shore, framed in the arch of Otto's boat hull roof. And she thought about the pencil line on the map, and she thought about the way Ellsworth had looked at the ceiling when he lost, and she thought about the small, tight motion of Odette's hand on his knuckles. She thought they were going to try again, because she had beaten them once in a room by pulling out a piece of paper, which was not a war, which was a coin toss, which they were going to make her win or lose over and over until she was tired enough to hand them what they wanted. She thought, I am going to have to become someone I am not in order to keep what she gave me. Then she thought, no, I am going to have to become someone I am, and I have never been given the room. She turned over, closed her eyes. She slept badly. The next morning she woke at 5:42 because the loon had started up again, and because a woman she had never met was standing beside her car in the gravel pad above the cottage. The woman was in her mid-50s, bleached hair pinned up with a plastic clip, reading glasses on a pink cord, a canvas cleaning bag over one shoulder, and a ring of keys the size of a small softball dangling from her wrist. She was frowning at Roz's Toyota with the professional impatience of a woman who had been told a driveway would be empty and had found it otherwise. Roz came out onto the little back porch in her sweatshirt and jeans, barefoot, hair a wreck. The woman looked her up and down and introduced herself. Simone. Cleaner, Nadine's. Roz allowed that she knew who she was. Nadine had talked about her. Simone hitched the bag on her shoulder and offered the flat opinion that Nadine had talked about everybody and had told her almost nothing. She had the West House at 8. She had been going to walk down and check the cottage. Nadine had always liked her to sweep it on Fridays. Habit. She was not sure Roz would want her to keep doing that. Rose thought for a moment. Not today, she offered. Then, because Nadine had raised her, she added the invitation. 5 minutes if Simone had them. Coffee. Simone considered. Simone had the face of a woman who did not enter houses she was not paid to enter unless she liked the person offering. Then she nodded once and came down the path. At the kitchen table over instant coffee, because that was what was in the cupboard. Simone offered a fact to unwrap, no cushion around it. Ellsworth had called her the night before. Wanted to know if she would be willing to add the cottage to her West House route. Told her Roz would probably be moving out by the end of the summer. Told her the family was going to rent this place out. The kettle ticked. Roz set her cup down. The words came out of her flatter than she expected. She was not moving out. Simone met her eyes and let the silence stand. She did not repeat herself. She did not need to. She added after a moment that Ellsworth had not asked her what her rate would be. He had told her, which she would allow with him because she had allowed it for 10 years. But if Roz ever wanted somebody to sweep this cottage, they would negotiate that between themselves. Roz almost smiled. It was unexpectedly the closest thing to a kindness anyone had offered her since Winifred had said sweetheart at 3:14 the day before. Simone finished her coffee in 3 swallows and stood. One more thing she offered. Odette had put a sign up at the fork yesterday afternoon. New one. Otsego Overlook. Arrow pointing down Roz's way. She mentioned it because Roz would see it when she walked up the path, and she would rather Roz saw it after coffee than before. Simone left through the caretaker's door. Roz sat with her empty cup for a long moment. Then she got up and put on her sneakers and walked up the shore path to the fork. The sign was exactly as Simone had described. White wood, navy lettering, Otsego Overlook, neatly screwed to the trunk of the maple. Arrow pointing down the branch of the path that ran directly past Roz's cottage, past her front porch along the shore. The old marker, Otto Halberstam, had burned into a piece of pine board in 1958, saying simply, West House lay behind the tree in the wet leaves. Someone had unscrewed it and dropped it there. On purpose or not, Roz could not tell. She picked up Otto's sign, brushed leaves off it, held it against her chest. Because this was, she understood, going to be the shape of it now. Small things, signs moved, cleaners called, assumptions made. Nothing large enough to fight publicly. Everything large enough to erode. And she was 24 years old and had a botany degree and a grandmother in the ground, and an uncle who had already tried once in a room to take a piece of paper from her. She walked back down the path. She was hanging the old marker over the caretaker's door when she heard the tires of the first rental car come around the bend. It was a black SUV, newer model, 2 heads in the front seat, a rack of suitcases visible through the rear window. The car slowed at the fork, turned, followed Odette's arrow, came down toward the cottage. Roz froze on the little porch with a hammer in her hand. The car pulled up in front of her cottage. The engine cut. The doors opened. A woman got out first, 60-ish. Pale linen pants. A sun hat still creased from packing. She held her phone out in front of her with the purse-mouth focus of a person who had followed a GPS pin and was refusing to admit she might be at the wrong address. The woman came up the path and asked cheerfully, but with a fissure of doubt beneath the cheer, whether this was Otsego Overlook. Rose took a breath, because the answer to that question was more than 1 sentence long, and the woman had not paid for a lecture. It was not Roz aloud, and left it at that. The woman blinked. She insisted, still cheerfully, that the listing had this cottage in the photos, the charming little one, the arched roof. She scrolled her phone, held it up. There it was on the screen, cottage shore path curling into the frame copper chimney cap, catching the sun. Under the photograph in Odette's careful marketing font, the words Otsego Overlook, a Halberstam family retreat, private caretaker's cottage on site. Rose did not scream, because Nadine had raised her, because Roz had learned at 11 years old, sitting in a principal's office, with her small pink suitcase, that if you screamed, the room became about your screaming and not about the reason you had screamed. Instead, she offered directions. The overlook was up the hill. If the woman would back her car up to the fork and take the other branch, she would find the parking pad. This cottage was a private residence. The woman's face went through 3 expressions in the space of a breath: confusion, embarrassment, and then faintly resentment, because being wrong is uncomfortable, and blaming the person who tells you you are wrong is human. She protested that the listing had been very clear. Roz allowed that she was sure it had been. The woman turned and went back to the car. Roz heard her say something to her husband, heard the husband say something back in the flat, muted tone husbands use when they have been told by GPS that they were wrong. The SUV reversed slowly back up the shore branch of the path, turned, disappeared toward the fork. Roz sat down on the porch step. She held the hammer in her lap. She thought briefly of the pea seeds, the tweezers, the fluorescent light of the lab, the clean, uncomplicated proposition of counting a thing that stayed still. Then she got up, because there was a nail sticking out of the marker, because the marker needed hanging, because the alternative to work, when everything else was falling in, was to sit down and disappear, and she was not going to disappear on Nadine's second day underground. She was still nailing the marker up when Halver Ames came around the bend. She had never met Halver. She had heard about him her whole life. She had eaten pies made by his late wife when she was 12. She had a birthday card somewhere in her Ithaca apartment that Halver had signed at the bottom of a group card in 2016. But she had never actually laid eyes on the man. Halver was 66, wide across the shoulders, white beard trimmed to the jaw, square wire glasses, a canvas coat that had been through weather, a knit cap that advertised a marina that had closed 15 years ago. He came down the path with the unhurried, purposeful walk of a man who had planned his morning around one particular chore and was going to complete it whether or not anyone had invited him to. He stopped 10 feet from the porch, looked at Roz, looked at the marker in her hands, looked at the nail, then observed without preamble that she was using the wrong hammer. Roz looked at the hammer. It was, she admitted, the only one she had found. He came up the steps, held out his hand, not for a shake, for the hammer. She handed it over. Halver looked at Otto's sign, ran a thumb over the burned letters, made a small sound in the back of his throat that was not exactly approval, but was very far from disapproval. Then he offered without warning that her great-grandfather had made it. Roz knew. Otto had used a soldering iron, Halver added. Had told everyone it was a wood-burning kit. Halver had been 15. He had believed him for a while. Roz asked quietly if he had known Otto. Halver had been 14 when Otto died. Otto had hired him for 2 summers to hold boards, paid him in root beer. Nadine had already been grown by then. Married, living in the West House. She used to bring Halvor sandwiches at lunch because Otto forgot. Halvor was, Roz realized, telling her a story. She had not expected a story. She had expected, she was not sure what she had expected. A grunt, a nod, a quote for gutter work. He handed the hammer back. He would bring her a finish hammer that afternoon, he offered, and a claw the right size. Nadine's tools were in the chest by the window. He knew because he had put half of them in there. But Nadine had liked his better and had borrowed. There should be a claw hammer with a red handle. Roz opened her mouth to protest the money. I did not want money. Nadine had paid him in April for the whole year. She had overpaid on purpose because she knew he was slow to invoice. So he owed her about 6 visits. He stopped. He looked at the caretaker's door. He looked at the low-arched roof. He looked at the copper chimney cap. He looked at the marker Roz had just nailed crookedly above the door. 58 years he had known this building. He offered half to her and half to the Pines. He had fallen asleep under that porch once when he was 17. Nadine's father had found him, had not woken him up, had put a blanket over him, had told Halver's mother he had been helping him. Roz did not know what to say to that, so she did not say anything, which turned out to be the right response because Halver did not appear to require one. He tipped his cap. He turned around. He walked back up the path. Roz watched him go until he disappeared around the fork. Then she sat on the porch step again, this time with the crooked marker above her head and her grandmother's failed-in cottage at her back, and the lake going silver in the mid-morning light. She sat there for a long time, because a stranger had just told her a story about her grandmother. Because a stranger who was not really a stranger had just informed her without saying it that she was not alone. She was not sure that was true. Not yet. Not in any way she could count on. But she was going to hold the possibility of it in the way you hold a small warm thing in your hand on a cold morning gently because you do not yet know if it is alive. At noon, Winifred Bly came down the path. Winifred was 71 and looked 60. Silver hair in a low bun, a canvas apron over a linen dress, a tote bag on one shoulder that appeared to contain a loaf of bread, a wax paper packet of what looked like brown eggs, and a paperback book with a broken spine. She had told herself she would not come today. Winifred offered in place of a hello. She had promised herself she would give Roz a day. Then she had remembered Roz would have eaten nothing but instant coffee, and her conscience had overruled her discipline. She set the tote on the kitchen table. Bread she itemized. From her oven, not the bakery. 3 eggs because Halvor's hens were laying and he could not eat them fast enough. The book was for later, not for today. Today Roz did not have to read anything. Roz stood in the kitchen and looked at the bread. Because a loaf of bread on a table still warm inside the tea towel it had been wrapped in, was the most physically real thing she had encountered in 24 hours, and it was going to break her if she let it. She did not let it, not entirely. But her eyes filled, and Winifred saw them fill, and Winifred blessedly did not say anything about it. She sat down at the table and she unwrapped the bread. And she looked at Roz with the flat, unsentimental affection of a woman who had loved another woman's granddaughter from a distance for 13 years. Halvor had been by Winifred noted as if reporting weather. He owed Nadine visits, Roz confirmed. He did, Winifred agreed. He had also loved her. He would not say that. Halvor would die before he said that. But it was a fact and Roz might as well know it. Roz sat down opposite her and pushed the news out flat. Odette had put the cottage in the rental listing. Winifred knew. She had seen it that morning. That was why she had brought bread. Roz stared at her. Winifred had brought bread, she clarified, because Nadine had left Roz the strangest building on the lake, and Winifred had wanted Roz to have a decent breakfast before she decided whether she could live in it. She cut 2 slices, passed one across. Then she offered over the table the sentence she had come down the path to offer. Nadine had chosen Roz. That was not a small thing. Roz's uncles would need to be persuaded that it was not in fact an easily reversed thing, and they would attempt to reverse it. Not because they were villains, because they were men who had been told their whole lives that the future ran through their hands, which in Nadine's family it did not. Rose tried to speak. Winifred held up a hand and continued. She was going to eat this bread, and then she was going to leave. Because Roz did not need company today. She needed bread, and she needed silence. But she wanted Roz to know one thing before she went. The question was not whether Roz could hold on to this cottage. The question was whether she could dare to live in it. Because Nadine had lived in it 36 years, and she had not done that as a punishment, and she had not done that as a compromise. She had done it because this strange little building was worth living in. And she had left it to Roz because she believed Roz was the only person in the family who could figure that out. Winifred ate her bread. Roz ate hers. They did not talk about anything else. Then Winifred kissed Roz on the temple, the way she had once kissed Nadine on the temple at a Christmas concert in 2011, and walked back up the path with her tote bag folded under her arm. Roz stood at the sink and washed the 2 plates. Then she called Odette. Odette answered on the second ring in the bright, warm register. Odette reserved for family members. She was hoping to head off at the pass. She had just been about to call, she offered. She wanted to know how Roz was settling in, whether she had found the good sheets. Roz cut the pleasantry off with her name. Odette pivoted into her explanation. She and Ellsworth had been putting together the listing yesterday afternoon, and he had mentioned that the cottage really added to the character of the property. Which it did. Such a charming little building. They had been going to talk to Roz about it, of course, but they had needed to get the listing live for the weekend traffic. Roz put the request across the line flat. Take the cottage out. Odette went into the sweetheart honey register. That was not really, it was part of the estate. It read as part of the estate. If they started carving things out, Roz repeated it. Take it out. By tonight. Or she would call the platform tomorrow morning and report the listing for misrepresentation, which they would remove. Because she owned the building and the photos, and she had not authorized the photos. And Odette knew that. There was a silence long enough for Roz to hear the small clock on Odette's dashboard tick. If Odette had a clock on her dashboard, which she probably did. Odette's voice came back different. The salesperson voice. The one Odette used when she was talking to a fellow agent about a deal that had turned sideways. She wondered aloud if Roz was really going to do this. Roz really was. Odette offered a small piece of moralism about the size of the gesture. That was the smallest, most petty way to start this. Did Roz understand that? Roz looked out the kitchen window at Otto's sign, at the shore path, at the low, late morning light on the water, at the porch step where she had sat that morning with a hammer in her lap and a stranger telling her a story. She kept her voice level. The smallest, most petty way to start this, she offered, had been putting her grandmother's house in the listing without asking her. She was simply matching Odette's energy. Take it out by tonight. She hung up. She stood at the sink for a full minute, her hand on the countertop, her heart doing something loud and uneven behind her ribs. Then she picked up the pencil she had left on the table that morning, and she walked into the sitting room, and she stood in front of Otto's old tool chest, because she was going to have to open it eventually, because Halvor had said her grandmother's tools were inside, because whatever she was going to build here, whatever wall she was going to nail up, whatever board she was going to sand smooth, whatever slow, careful piece of her grandmother's life she was going to lift into her own hands was going to require tools. And the tools were in the chest, and the chest was in her house. She opened it. The smell that came up was cedar and iron oil, and the particular ghost of pipe tobacco her great-grandfather Otto had smoked, and that had somehow impossibly still lived in the wood 98 years later. Roz knelt down. Right on top, laid across the tray, was a small folded piece of paper. She unfolded it. Nadine's handwriting, the flat chemistry teacher script. One line. The maps are in the cedar box under the upstairs bed. Read them in order. I love you. Roz sat back on her heels. The loon called on the water. Somewhere up the hill at the West House, a car door slammed. A cleaner arrived. A cabinet man arrived. A brother made a phone call. A sister-in-law revised a listing. A daughter watched all of it with a still face and something feeding underneath. Down the hill in a cottage her great-grandfather had built in 1928, and her grandmother had lived in for 36 years, a 24-year-old woman named Rosalind Halberstam knelt in front of an open tool chest and held a piece of paper that had been left for her. She folded it, careful, in thirds. She put it in the front pocket of her jeans. She climbed the narrow stairs to the upstairs room, because Nadine had told her where the maps were. Because Nadine, who had never in her life issued an instruction that was not the instruction, had told her to read them in order. And Roz was going to read them. She was going to read every one. The cedar box was under the bed, exactly where Nadine had said it would be. Roz slid it out on her palms because it was heavier than she had expected. Old walnut, not cedar. Nadine had probably called it a cedar box for 40 years because she had once stored cedar sachets in it, and Nadine had been the kind of woman who named a thing once and did not renegotiate. The hinges were brass. The lid was scarred where somebody generations back had used the box as a chopping surface. There was no lock. Rose set the box on the bed, sat down beside it, rested one hand on the lid, just for a moment, because whatever was in this box her grandmother had put there for her, which meant the box was the last piece of correspondence she was ever going to receive, which meant she was in a small and unreasonable way afraid of it. She opened the box. Notebooks, 11 of them, not fat leather journals with gold-edged pages, not the kind of thing you would ever photograph for a magazine. They were the cheap composition notebooks. Nadine had bought a dozen at a time at the drugstore in town, black speckled covers, wide-ruled, the kind school children carried. Each one had a small white sticker on the front spine, and each sticker had a year written on it in Nadine's flat handwriting. Not every year. Nadine had started a new notebook only when the last one filled, which meant some notebooks covered 3 years and some covered 2, and the one on top, 2024, was thinner than the rest. It was thinner because Nadine had died in August, and August was a month for beginnings, not endings, and she had not gotten far. Roz picked up the earliest one, 1988. The paper was yellow at the edges. The ink was ballpoint black, in some entries blue in others. The handwriting was younger, a Nadine of 33, not 71, but recognizable. The same forward slant. The same refusal of curly cues. Roz opened to the first page. She had expected foolishly a diary. She had expected a woman's private voice. Confessions, regrets, the long, slow reckoning of a mother whose daughter had married against her wishes and moved 400 miles away and died young in weather nobody had forecast. That was not what the notebook was. The notebook was a log. Rain overnight 1.2 inches. Channel behind cottage cleared at 6:30. Debris pine needles heavy 1 small branch. Downspout at west corner, recheck secure. Note to replace great wire by fall current 1, bent from ice. The next day. Clear. Cool. Wind northwest. Path stones set back by frost heaved 3 at the fork. 1 at the birch reset by hand. The next. Rain 0.4 inches. Channel holding. Page after page after page. Weather. Water. Which stones had moved. Which trees had dropped which limbs. Which drain grate had bent under which ice. When the well pump had cycled and how many minutes it had cycled for. When the shore had frozen and when it had thawed and how many days between. Roz turned pages faster because she was looking for herself, which was a shameful and human thing to be looking for. And because a child raised by a grandmother wants more than she wants dignity, to know that her name appeared somewhere in that grandmother's private handwriting. She found herself in July of 1988. Not by name, by initial. R arrived. Small, quiet. Sat on porch until dark. Ate half a sandwich. Drank the milk. Slept 14 hours. Roz's breath caught. Because she had been 11 that summer. Because she had not slept the night before her grandmother had picked her up from the principal's office. Because she remembered now, slept an unreasonable amount that first week at the lake, waking to find sunlight in the arch window. No one calling her and Nadine downstairs in the kitchen doing something that involved the smell of bacon. She turned the page. Another entry 3 days later. Her help clear channel. Held the trowel wrong. Did not complain. Learn quickly. That was the whole entry. That was the whole entry. And Roz put the notebook down on her knees and pressed the heel of her hand against her mouth because she was going to make a noise she did not want to make in a house she was still learning to be alone in. Did not complain. Learned quickly. Not I love her. Not she is mine now. Not I will raise this child. Just 5 words in a weather log and a notebook nobody but Nadine had ever opened. And under those 5 words in ink that had been dry for 38 years was every promise a woman had ever made to a child without saying the promise out loud. Roz sat on the bed for a long time. Then she went downstairs and made herself a second cup of coffee. Because the notebooks were going to take her days. Because Nadine had said to read them in order. And because Nadine had never once in Roz's life issued an instruction that did not turn out to be, in retrospect, exactly the instruction. She read for 2 hours before she heard the truck. The truck pulled up on the gravel pad above the cottage. Engine older than the one she had heard the day before. She looked up from the notebook out through the front window and saw a bumper, the color of old moss, and a fender that had been replaced with a silver door from a different truck entirely. Halvor. He came down the path with 2 hammers and a small square wooden box under his arm. He knocked once on the caretaker's door, a real knock, not a courtesy tap, and let himself in when Roz called out. He set the finish hammer on the kitchen table, set the claw hammer, the small one beside it, set the wooden box down last. It was maybe the size of a shoebox. Cedar, this one, really cedar. Roz could smell it. The lid had a small brass latch. She asked what it was. He offered it as her grandmother's carpentry kit. Not the tools, the measurements. Every board she cut in this cottage for 30 years. The size of the wood where it went. Also the drainage sketches. She had made him copy those years ago. She had wanted a second set in case the house burned. He had given the second set back to her when his wife died, and he had stopped needing to feel useful. Roz looked at the box, then at Halvor, then at the box again. She asked quietly how her grandmother had died. Halvor stood very still. He was a man who had, Roz was learning, exactly two speeds. The unhurried, purposeful walk down a path, an absolute stillness, which meant he was thinking about how much of an answer the question deserved. He offered it plain. He had found her at noon on Tuesday. She had been in her chair by the front window, the one with the arched back. Her tea had been on the little table beside her, still warm enough that he had put his hand around the cup and it had not been cold yet. She had had her reading glasses on. She had been looking at a notebook, the one on top upstairs, the 2024 one. He had closed it and put it back where Roz would find the rest. He had not read it. He had not wanted to. Rose's eyes went to the cedar box on the bed upstairs, then without meaning to the composition notebook still on her lap. She thanked him. He nodded. Once. Turned and left. Roz sat with the finish hammer in her hand for a long time before she moved. Then she went upstairs. She sat on the bed. She picked up the thin 2024 notebook. And she opened it from the back this time because if her grandmother had been writing in it on the morning she died, the last entry would tell her something. The last entry was 3 lines long. Rain forecast for Saturday. Clear the shore path channel Thursday if you can. If you cannot, do not worry. The channel has held 96 years without help. Roz read the entry twice. She read it a third time because it was addressed to her. Because you was not a Nadine word in a weather log. Because Nadine had at some point in the last months of her life begun writing these notebooks for someone else to read. She flipped forward, or backward depending on how you counted. She looked at entries from June, from May, from April, from January of that year. They had all shifted. Somewhere around the previous autumn, the entries had begun to include second-person notes. Small, not many. But there, grate at the west corner is due for replacement. When you do it, use galvanized wire, not plain steel. Plain rusts in one winter. First snow, 2 inches, not heavy. The path stones under the birch shift every year when the ground freezes. You will learn to expect it. Ellsworth called about the taxes again. Answered him. Did not tell him what I intend. Do not tell him either when the time comes. Let the will do the telling. Roz put the notebook down, slowly, because do not tell him either was not a note in a weather log. Do not tell him either was an instruction delivered from a woman who had known she was dying, or at least had begun to plan for the possibility to a granddaughter she had already silently prepared to inherit not just a cottage, but a small and total campaign of resistance. Nadine had not left her a house. Nadine had left her a war already half fought with the maps drawn and the sight lines cleared in the position she was to hold, marked in pencil on a piece of paper folded into thirds in her purse. Roz sat on the edge of the bed with her hands flat on her knees. Then she said out loud to the empty room that this was fine. Just the one word after that. Okay. Because it was a promise, and Nadine had never trusted long promises. Downstairs, someone knocked on the caretaker's door. It was Thaddeus. He was carrying a ladder, which was not in itself remarkable. Thaddeus was a man who transported things without warning. But the ladder was Nadine's ladder, the wooden one from the shed, which meant Thaddeus had walked down the hill, gone into the shed, taken the ladder without asking, and now stood at Roz's door in the pretending posture of a man who was returning something he had never taken. He asked in the register of a man asking permission for something he had already done, whether she needed it. He was going to borrow it for the porch light, but if she needed it, she waved him through. Take it, she offered. Bring it back Friday. He blinked. He would. Sure. Friday. Roz added before she thought about it that she loved him and she meant it, that he should bring the ladder back Friday. She had not until she said it been sure the words I love you would come out. But they did, because they were true, because Thaddeus had in his own soft-shouldered way been the uncle who had actually shown up, not often, not consistently, but more than Ellsworth ever had. He had come to her college graduation. He had sent Trix down one summer to keep her company. He was not and had never been the villain in this house. He was something worse and softer, which was a man who kept quiet when his brother spoke, because his brother had always spoken first. Thaddeus stood with a ladder against his hip and looked at her for a moment. Trix had asked him to say that she wanted to come by tomorrow, he offered. If that was all right, she had said not to make food. She would bring food. Roz allowed that both things were all right. Thaddeus lingered. Roz asked how Odette was. He hesitated. Odette was going through a thing. Which thing? The market was slow, he offered, half turning to leave. She had had 2 deals fall through in July. Ellsworth had been, he stopped himself. Because Nadine had raised him too, and Nadine had trained her sons not to gossip about their wives. Roz let it go. Take the ladder. Friday. He was almost to the porch step when he stopped and turned around. About yesterday, he offered in Inez's office. The map. The one Ellsworth had submitted. He had not known about it. She knew. I wanted her to know he had not known about it. She knew. He nodded. He walked up the path. Roz stood in the doorway watching him go, and she thought with a kind of sad clarity that surprised her that he had told her because he needed to say it out loud, not because she had needed to hear it. He was the middle child of a difficult woman, and he was going to spend the rest of his life explaining himself to somebody. It might as well be her. Then she went inside and put on a second pot of coffee, because Trix was coming tomorrow, because tomorrow was going to matter. Trix came at 11 and she brought a bag of pears. The pears were small and pale green and slightly bruised at the stems, which meant Trix had picked them herself off the tree in her father's yard. Trix set the bag on the kitchen table. She did not sit down. She stood in the middle of the sitting room with her hands in her jacket pockets, and she looked around at the boxes and the upside-down chairs and the tool chest and the ceramic rooster on the mantel. She looked at the arched roof beams overhead. She looked at the half-round window at the top of the stairs. She looked at everything the way a 16-year-old girl looks at a room she has been told her whole life is the wrong room. The place was weird, Trix pronounced. Roz knew. It was like a boat that got stuck on land. Roz allowed that this was exactly what it was. Otto Halberstam's grandfather had built boats in Norway. Otto had built the cottage the way his grandfather had taught him. Trix considered this and decided it was actually cool. She added without transition that her mother had said it was cursed. Rose laughed once before she could stop herself. It was the first laugh she had produced since Winifred had said sweetheart at 3:14 on Wednesday, and it came out rusty. Trix elaborated. Her mother had said it was cursed with charm, which was mom speak for she wanted to knock it down. Roz sat down on the arm of the sofa and gestured Trix over. Trix came and sat on the other arm. She asked how much of what happened at the East House Trix actually heard. All of it, Trix offered. Her father talked in the kitchen, and the kitchen was under her room, and her mother did not whisper. She thought she whispered. She did not. Roz nodded slow. Trix reached into her jacket, pulled out her phone. She did not turn the screen toward Roz immediately. She held it face down on her knee for a second, the way you hold a thing you know you cannot unshow. Then she flipped it over. It was a screenshot. A text thread between Ellsworth and Odette. Timestamped 10 days before Nadine had died. The messages ran between Roz's fingers like cold water. Ellsworth had talked to the Renfield group again. They would go 700 for all 3 parcels combined if he could deliver clean title on the back lot. His mother was still saying no on that piece, but she was slowing down. One bad winter, she would be in assisted living, and they could move. Odette had asked whether that was 700 combined or per. Combined, Ellsworth had confirmed. Split 3 ways after debt. Still 200 each conservatively. Odette had asked about Rosalind. She would be a third when Nadine went. Rosalind, Ellsworth had answered, would get the cottage. She would sell it inside a year. Girl lived in Ithaca. She did not want a lake house. They would buy her out at cottage value plus a courtesy $20,000, and she would thank them for the ride. Rose read the messages twice, then a third time, because on the third reading she noticed the phrase bad winter, and the phrase assisted living, and the phrase we can move, and she understood with a cold, slow clarity that arrived low in her stomach that her uncle had been counting on her grandmother's decline as a business timeline. Trix watched her face. Roz asked when she had found the messages. 2 weeks ago, Trix had been on the family iPad and it had not logged out of her mother's messages. She had taken the screenshot. She had not known what to do with it. She had told her grandmother. She had gone to see Nadine. She had driven up. On the bus, she had not told her father. Nadine had made her pancakes and had read the screenshot 4 times and had told her good Beatrix, "Thank you, don't tell anyone else, I'll handle it." And that had been the last time Trix had seen her. Rose put both hands flat on her thighs, because Nadine had known. Because Nadine had known 10 days before she died that her elder son had been shopping her land to a developer while she was still alive. Because Nadine had gone home from the pancake breakfast with her 16-year-old granddaughter, and she had apparently driven to Ines Marchetti's office, and she had rewritten the map, and she had drawn a pencil line to a birch tree, and she had begun writing notes to the you she was leaving everything to. She had put her whole last will and testament in the front pocket of Roz's jeans, folded into thirds, and she had died in her chair with her tea beside her before anyone had known the game was already lost. Rose put her hand on Trix's forearm. Just once. She told her low that Trix was the reason she had this cottage. Trix shook her head. Grandma was. Trix was one of the reasons. Trix looked down at her hands. She had chipped black polish on her thumbnails and a little cheap silver ring on her index finger. She looked for one moment exactly the age she was, which was a girl who had done a hard adult thing and was not sure whether it had been the right thing. She did not like the way her father went quiet when Ellsworth talked, she confessed. She never had. He got small, like his shoulders came in. She had hated it since she was 7. She did not want to be that. Rose told her she was not. She did not want him to be that either. Roz allowed that she knew. They ate pears, because sometimes a woman raised by another woman and a girl on the edge of being raised by no one sit at a table in a strange arched house and eat pears out of a paper bag. And that is what love looks like on a Thursday in August in the year somebody has died. After Trix left, Roz opened the cedar box on the sitting room table. Inside, exactly as Halver had said, were her grandmother's carpentry measurements. Small graph paper cards, one for each board with a diagram, a location, a wood type, a date. And beneath the cards in a manila envelope with the words Drainage Master written across the flap in Nadine's flat handwriting were 7 pages of drawings. Not decorative drawings, engineering drawings. The property and plan view, every downspout, every catch basin, every underground line, the path of every seasonal stream when the ground was frozen, the way water flowed off the road above the cottage in a heavy rain, and where exactly it went if you did not intervene, and where it went if you did. At the bottom of the last page, Nadine had written a note, in pencil, in her tightest, smallest hand. The cottage is the only structure that has never flooded. Not once. 96 years. The 2 lake houses have flooded in 1954, in 1972, in 1996, and in 2011. The men who built them were educated. Otto was not. Otto watched where the water went. That is the difference. Roz sat back. She looked around her sitting room, at the low arched ceiling, at the boat hole curve of the beams, at the strange, small, unfashionable building her great-grandfather had put on the exact slope where a range sheeted off the road and split harmlessly around a rise in the earth that Otto Halberstam had understood without ever being able to name it. And she thought this is not a consolation prize. She thought this is an answer. She was still thinking it when Halver pulled up in his truck for the 2nd time that week. This time he did not come to the door. He came to the porch step. He sat down on it with a small canvas roll in his hand. He unrolled it on his knees. Inside were a set of chisels, a plumb bob, a wooden square, in a battered aluminum level with a bubble the color of good honey. He offered without preamble that he was going to teach her to read the slope of her land, because if she was going to live in this cottage, she had to know where the water went. And she had to know it in her hands, not on a piece of paper. Paper was fine. Paper was her grandmother. But paper burned. Roz sat down beside him. She thanked him. I waved it off. Do not thank him. This was what he owed Nadine. Then he was done. Then he was going back to being an old man who complained about the price of lumber. She told him he was never going to be done. Do not tell him what he was, he answered. But he said it without heat. He said it the way a man says a thing he wants you to argue with. Then he stood up. He handed her the plumb bob. He instructed her plainly to come outside. They were going to spend the next hour looking at dirt. They spent the next hour looking at dirt. Then they spent the hour after that looking at more dirt. Roz learned to sight a slope with a plumb bob and a length of mason's twine. She learned to read the way pine roots grew at the surface, where the water table was high, and dove where the water table dropped. She learned to walk a piece of ground with her eyes half closed, feeling the pitch through the soles of her sneakers, the way Halvor's grandfather had taught Halvor, the way Otto Halberstam had taught his son, the way Nadine had apparently taught nobody at all in her own generation, because her own generation had not been listening. She was bad at it. She was bad at it in the specific and clarifying way that meant her body was going to learn it and her mind was going to stop objecting. She tipped the level 3 times before she held it right. She cited a slope wrong on the second try, and Halvor told her to walk it again without inflection, and she walked it again. She burst a small blood vessel in her thumb, hammering a stake at the wrong angle. He observed that she was gripping the hammer like it was going to run away from her and told her to loosen up. She loosened up. The stake went in. At the end of the second hour, she was sunburned and tired and calmer than she had been since Winifred's phone call, and Halvor took the plumb bob back and rolled up the canvas and told her that tomorrow they would do the channel behind the cottage. Bring gloves. She asked one more time why. He looked at her over his square wire glasses. Because she had asked how Nadine had died, he offered. And he had told her Nadine had been reading a notebook. And he had been thinking about it since. And he had concluded that Nadine had been reading the notebook because she had been writing the ending. And he did not intend to make her ending false. He walked to his truck. He got in. He drove away. Roz stood in her sunburned exhaustion at the edge of the shore path, and she watched the truck go, and she understood with the same slow clarity she had felt in the bedroom that morning that her grandmother had not left her the cottage alone. Her grandmother had left her a small, quiet, defensive circle of people. Halvor, Winifred, Simone, Ines, Trix. People who had loved a difficult woman and who had, without any of them consulting each other, decided independently that they were going to make sure that difficult woman's granddaughter did not have to fight this fight by herself. Roz went inside. She washed her hands. She sat at the kitchen table. She opened notebook number 6, 2007, the year she had turned 5. The year Nadine had begun making her stay 2 weeks in the summer instead of 1. She read. She was still reading when the knock came at the caretaker's door. Odette. Odette in the doorway without asking to come in. Odette in white linen pants that had not been chosen for a path with mud on it, in a straw bag over her shoulder, and lipstick in the color she wore for open houses. Odette holding a small stack of paint chips. She launched before Roz could speak into her opener. She had been up at the West House measuring drapes and had thought she had wanted to take a look. Because Nadine's little cottage had such wonderful bones, and she had been thinking that with just a few small adjustments to open up the flow, Roz interrupted with her name. Odette pressed on. Roz could really let the space breathe. That arch was beautiful, but it was fighting the light. If they opened up the wall between the kitchen and the sitting room, Roz said her name a second time. Odette continued. The third Odette was quiet, which was Roz was learning the register that stopped her. Because Odette had spent 30 years selling houses to nervous women, and Odette had trained herself to hear the exact moment a voice went flat. Odette stopped. Rose kept her voice level. The cottage had been breathing for 98 years. It did not require Odette's assistance. It required her to go back up the hill. Odette held her smile for one long beat. Then the smile did something small and painful at the corners. She protested that she had been trying to help. Roz knew. Odette countered with a small note of injury that this was a hurtful thing to say to a woman who had been trying to help. Roz let a beat go by. Then she offered the sentence flat. She had seen the text messages. Odette stopped moving entirely. Because Odette was a very good salesperson, and very good salespeople know the second the ground has shifted under them. She did not ask which messages. She did not pretend confusion. She simply stood in the doorway with the paint chips fanned out in her hand and her face going through very quickly. 3 separate arrangements, surprise, denial, and something older and more tired. That was neither. She asked how. Roz did not answer. Odette insisted it mattered to her. Rose allowed it did not matter to her. Odette lowered the paint chips. She began the second version of the sentence. Ellsworth was under more pressure than Roz knew. Roz knew some of it. I had real debt, Odette offered, and there was, for the first time, no marketing tone in her voice. Real, not story debt, real numbers, and the West House did not cover it, not at current bookings. And they needed for that back parcel to be sold or borrowed against, and it could not be borrowed against because it was not one of theirs. Roz allowed that it was one of hers, which was why she had been trying to be a friend to Roz, because a friend to Roz was a friend to them. That was not evil, Rosalind. That was family. Roz looked at Odette for a long moment, because Odette believed it. That was the thing. Odette actually believed on some level that being warm to a niece she had never in her life sent a birthday card was a kind of currency that could be spent later when the niece was standing between Odette's husband and Odette's mortgage. Roz put the sentence across the doorway soft. Go back up the hill. Odette went. She did not slam the door. Odette did not slam doors. Odette closed the door with the pointed gentleness of a woman making a note. Roz sat with her forehead resting on her fists. Because she had that day laughed once. She had cried 3 times. She had learned to sight a slope with a plumb bob. She had told her uncle she loved him and told her aunt to leave, and told her cousin that she was one of the reasons Roz had a house. She had held Nadine's tools in her hands and read her grandmother's private handwriting, and learned that she had been chosen 10 days before her grandmother died by way of a 16-year-old girl on a bus. She had in one day been given more of her own life than she had held in 5 years. She was going to be tired for a long time. She was going to have to keep going anyway. Dinner at Thaddeus and Odette's East House was on a Sunday, and Roz was invited, and Roz went because that is how you were raised. The table was long, set for 6. Thaddeus and Odette and Trix and Ellsworth's wife, Marielle, who did not come to the lake often, and who had come this time Roz suspected as a witness. And Roz. Salmon on a white platter. Lemon slices arranged so neatly they looked mechanical. A bottle of wine Ellsworth spent 4 minutes explaining. Trix caught Roz's eye across the table and did not blink. Ellsworth raised his glass. To family, he offered. Everyone raised their glass. Roz raised hers. Ellsworth drank. Then he set the glass down. Then he pulled a folder out from under his chair and laid it on the table beside the salmon. The folder was black, leather. The kind of folder a man carries into a meeting he intends to win. He opened it. Inside were drawings. Rose did not need to lean forward. Ellsworth turned the folder around so she could see. 4 glass and steel houses along the shore. A parking pad where the cottage was. A landscaped walkway to the water. The pines gone. The birch gone. The cottage, Otto's cottage. Her grandmother's cottage. Her cottage not marked as removed. Just not marked at all. As if it had never been there. Renfield Development, Ellsworth offered. Their number was on the last page. It was a generational offer. 3 parcels combined 40% above independent market. Split 3 or any of them. Trix put her fork down, very quietly, beside her plate. Odette watched Roz. Thaddeus watched his own hands. Marielle watched Ellsworth, and something in Marielle's face. Roz had never really looked at Marielle's face before, was tired in the specific way of a woman who had stopped being surprised. Roz set her napkin beside her plate. She did not answer Ellsworth. She stood up. She thanked Odette for the salmon. She noted formal as a Christmas card that it had been very good. She walked to the sideboard. She picked up the folder. She carried it with her out onto the East House porch and down the wooden steps and along the shore path, in the last dusk light past the fork with Odette's Otsego Overlook sign down to her cottage. She set the folder on Nadine's kitchen table. She did not open it again. She sat with it in front of her for a long time. Then, because she was a botanist, and botanists work with their hands when they cannot work with their heads, she got up. She went out to the shed. She found 4 wooden stakes and a mallet and a coil of orange mason's twine. She walked the property line her grandmother had drawn in pencil. She drove 1 stake at the corner of the cottage, 1 at the birch, 1 at the halfway mark along the shore, and 1 where the pencil line met the shore itself. She strung the orange twine between them, ankle-high taut enough to snap if you kicked it, and low enough that nobody who was not looking for it would see it before their shin did. She did it in the last blue light of the day, alone, in a t-shirt smeared with dirt, her hair falling out of its clip, her hands blistered from the mallet. Simone Duquette walked past on the shore path on her way back from a late changeover at the West House. She stopped at the birch and she looked at the orange twine and she looked at Roz. Nadine had waited a long time for that line Simone offered. Roz was slower than she had thought, but she had gotten there. She walked on. Rose did not answer her, because Simone had not asked a question, because a woman who has been paid for 10 years to clean up after another family's laziness does not need to be answered when she offers you the closest thing to a benediction she is willing to give in public. Roz drove the last stake in. She sat down beside it, on the ground, in the dirt. With her back against the birch her grandmother had marked in pencil the winter before she died. She looked back at the cottage. From the birch in the twilight, the cottage looked exactly like the boat hall her grandmother had said. It was a small, strange, low-roofed shape among the pines, with a warm yellow window and a copper chimney cap turning green in the last of the sun. Roz put her hand on the trunk of the birch. She spoke it out loud to nobody. "Okay, Nan, I'm here." The lake made its small evening sounds. The loon started up on the far shore, and somewhere up the hill in a warm dining room, a man in an expensive shirt was sitting alone with a plate of salmon he was no longer hungry for, and a folder full of glass and steel houses he could no longer sell, and a wife who was for the first time in her marriage watching him without helping. He did not know it yet, but the ground had moved under him. And in the small, strange building his grandfather had built, and his mother had lived in, and his niece had that evening staked out with orange twine, a young woman with dirt on her hands and blisters on her palms was going to sleep in a bed under an arched window, and she was going to sleep well for the first time since Wednesday, because she had at last understood what her grandmother had left her. Not a house, not a parcel, a position, and Roz was going to hold it. The forecast came in on a Tuesday. Roz was on her knees behind the cottage clearing pine duff out of the drainage channel with a pair of Halver's leather gloves that were 3 sizes too big when the weather alert buzzed her phone. She sat back on her heels, wiped her forehead with the inside of her wrist, read the screen. Post-tropical system Kellen. Landfall Friday evening. Rainfall 4 to 6 inches inland. Wind gusts to 55. Coastal warnings extending north to central New York State. Central New York State, which was here, which was Otsego Lake, which was in 3 days going to be 4 inches of rain landing on a slope her great-grandfather had studied in 1928, and her grandmother had studied for 36 years after him, and Roz, 24 years old with blistered palms and a botany degree, and a cottage staked out in orange twine, had known about that slope for exactly 2 weeks. She read the alert twice. Then she went inside. Then she pulled notebook number 7 off the sitting room shelf. 2011, the year of the last big storm that had flooded both lake houses. She turned to August. She read her grandmother's entry slowly, twice. Storm arriving evening, cleared channel at dawn. Reset 3 stones under birch. Move bench uphill. Oh. Note the pump at the west house cycles twice per hour in dry weather. Underload it cycles constant. If it burns out during a full house, guests have no water, told Ellsworth. He said he heard me. Under the entry in different ink added later the correction. He did not hear me. The pump burned out on the Saturday. He blamed the storm. It was not the storm. It was the pump. Rose closed the notebook. She picked up her phone. She called her uncle. Ellsworth answered on the fourth ring in the voice he used for calls he did not want to take from people he could not afford to hang up on. Rosalind. She put the storm up front. Kellen was coming Friday. 4 to 6 inches. Had he had Bennett out to look at the pump? He had it handled. That was not an answer. He had it handled. He had a pump company on speed dial. Bennett would not come out same day in a storm. I had a pump company on speed dial. She waited. Because pump company on speed dial was a phrase, and phrases were what Ellsworth Halberstam produced when he had not in fact called anyone. She asked one more time whether he had guests in the West House this weekend. A pause. 2 couples. Anniversary weekend. Booked in April. She told him to call Bennett in the morning, to ask for the pressure switch check and a pump housing inspection, to tell him it was ahead of Kellen and Bennett would move him up the list. He did not need her to run his rental. She was not running it. She was telling him what Nadine had told him in 2011. The line was quiet, long enough that Roz thought she had lost the call. Then he asked in the voice of a man who had suddenly realized the sentence was a citation what? She told him the date, August 22nd, 2011. Nadine had told him the pump cycled too much. He had told her he heard her. He had not. It had burned out on the Saturday of a full booking. She had written it down. Another silence. She had written it down. Yes. Where? In one of 11 notebooks she had left Roz. Ellsworth Halberstam, elder son Silver at the temple, said nothing for a full 10 seconds, which was in Ellsworth years a lifetime. Then he said in a different voice, a small, tired voice, Roz had not heard from him before that he would call Bennett in the morning. He hung up. Roz sat at the kitchen table with her phone in her hand, and she looked out the window at Otto's tool chest and Otto's ceramic rooster and the roof beams of Otto's failed inn, and she thought with something that was not quite triumph and not quite sadness that he had never in her life admitted he had not heard his mother, and he just had. She did not have time to feel it. Because Kellen was coming, she went out to work. By Wednesday afternoon, she had cleared the channel behind the cottage a second time deeper. She had checked every downspout. She had reset 4 path stones that frost had shifted the previous winter and never been reset. She had moved Otto's bench, the one at the waterline, the one Nadine had sat on to watch the loons 6 feet up the slope with Halver's help, and buried its legs against the 2 iron anchors Nadine had driven into the ground in 1998 for exactly this purpose. Halvor observed when they were done that Nadine had thought of everything, which was why Roz was going to think of everything, which was why they were going to walk the West House line together, whether her uncle wanted them to or not. They walked it Wednesday evening. The West House sat above them, its windows warm with somebody else's dinner. 2 rental cars in the drive. A canoe on the porch that was going to have to come inside before Friday. A stack of firewood against the north wall that was Roz realized as she stood looking at it, blocking the lower vent on the crawl space. She pointed. Halvor followed her finger. That was new, he observed. Since Ellsworth had started renting, Roz confirmed. Since June. He had been told about it. Rose did not knock on the West House door. She would have if Nadine had asked her to. Nadine had not. Nadine had written in a note dated April that Roz should not manage his house for him. It was not hers to manage, but she should keep her own house safe from his mistakes. Rose turned around. She walked back down the shore path. Halvor followed her. At the fork, he stopped. If that vent stayed blocked and they got 4 inches in a wind, Roz might have water in her cottage for the first time in 98 years. Not from her side, from his. She thought about it. Then she offered that she would call Trix, because Trix could do a thing Roz could not. Trix could go up to the West House on the pretense of dropping something off, walk around the north side, move the firewood, and be back down the shore path in 12 minutes without ever saying a word to the guests inside. Trix was there in an hour. She moved the firewood. She stacked it against the shed instead. She came down to the cottage after and helped herself to the last of Roz's coffee. She had told the guests the wind was going to knock the pile onto their porch, she reported satisfied. They had thanked her. Uncle Ellsworth had no idea. Roz told her she was going to run the world someday, and she felt sorry for the world. Trix grinned. She looked in that moment exactly like Nadine had at a Christmas in 2015 when she had won an argument about pie crust without raising her voice. By Thursday night, Roz had done everything her grandmother's 7 pages of engineering drawings said to do. By Friday at 3, the sky over the far shore had begun to bruise. By Friday at 6, the first bands of rain arrived. Not hard, steady, the kind of rain that lulls a person into thinking a storm might turn out to be only a night in with a book. By 9, the wind had picked up. By 10, the power went out. Rose was in her sitting room with 2 lanterns on the table and a mug of tea in her hand and notebook at number 11. The last one, the thin one, open on her knee. Because if she was going to sit through her first storm in Otto's cottage, she was going to sit through it in her grandmother's company. Even if her grandmother's company was ink on cheap paper. The lantern flickered when the lights died. She did not flinch. She had checked the flashlight batteries twice. Rain hit the roof and slid off the way. Rain had slid off that roof for nearly 100 years down the cedar shingles, along the perfectly pitched eaves, into the gutters, out through the downspouts, into the channel Nadine had cleared, and Roz had re-cleared along the slope Otto had chosen, because water went around the rise instead of through it and down to the lake. The cottage stayed dry. The wind rose. A branch snapped somewhere above the road. Somewhere a car door slammed and did not slam again. At 10:40, someone pounded on the caretaker's door. Roz opened it. Ellsworth stood in the doorway in a soaked shirt with the sleeves rolled up wrong. Behind him, 4 people, 2 couples, middle-aged, in dripping raincoats with tote bags and a case of wine, in one small suitcase that had clearly been dressed for a boutique hotel and had ended up standing in the mud beside a cottage porch. There was no water at the house, Ellsworth offered flat. No preamble, no apology. Because Ellsworth Halberstam was a man in the specific kind of trouble that removes preamble. Roz stepped back from the door. "Come in," she told them. "All of you." The couples came in, damp and grateful and quiet. One of the women had a red spot high on each cheekbone that meant fever, not embarrassment. Roz clocked it. She turned over her shoulder and told Ellsworth to get the lanterns from the shelf. Both. Then to go back up and pull the breaker on the pump if he had not already. He had. Good. She was already moving, because a woman with a fever and a wet coat needed to be warm, and warm required blankets, and the blankets were in the black garbage bag under the sofa. Because 4 adults in her sitting room required chairs, and the chairs were upside down on top of the sofa, and moving them required both hands. Because her cottage was for the first time in 98 years becoming a shelter for people who had not intended to shelter in it, and Roz had exactly 1 chance to get this right. She got it right. Within 20 minutes, the feverish woman was on the sofa under a wool blanket with a thermos of hot water in her hands and Roz's own bottle of ibuprofen on the table beside her. The other 3 guests were at the kitchen table with 3 of Nadine's mismatched mugs of instant coffee. Ellsworth was on his phone in the doorway, trying from a signal that kept dropping to find any motel within 40 minutes with 2 available rooms. There were none, because Kellen had knocked power out to the whole valley, and every displaced traveler between here and Cooperstown was calling every motel on the same list. Rose was standing at the sink when the second knock came. It was Thaddeus, rain-plastered, a flashlight in one hand, his voice going up at the ends of his sentences the way it always did when he was afraid. The east basement was flooding, Roz supplied. Not seeping, flooding. The trench behind the house, the new one the contractor had left half open, it had collapsed. It was channeling straight into the lower wall. Marielle was upstairs with Odette and Trix. Odette had a headache and Trix was Roz cut across it. Where was his wet vacuum? They did not have one. The contractor had taken theirs. Take Roz's, she directed. Utility closet. Then come back. Bring the shovels from the shed. He turned to go. She called after him. Bring the shovels. He went. Roz turned back to the woman on the sofa, checked her temperature with the back of her hand. Warm, not dangerous yet. Told her to keep drinking. Told her husband to sit with her. Then she picked up her rain jacket off the peg beside the door and put it on. Ellsworth stared at her. She was going up to the east house, he observed. Not a question. As if he were watching a person he had not known was in the room. She was. With Thad. Yes. In this, she told him to move. He moved. Because there had never been a version of Ellsworth Halberstam's life until that Friday night in which anyone had ever told him to move without dressing the sentence in a compliment first. And Roz had not dressed it. And Ellsworth, silver-templed, calibrated Ellsworth, who had brought a leather folder to a salmon dinner and lost, stepped out of her way, like a man who had at last understood that the woman he had underestimated was the woman running the room. She went up the hill. The rain was blowing sideways now, wind pushing water off the pines in sheets. The path was slick with pine tar, and the flashlight beam picked out the orange twine she had strung 2 weeks earlier, still holding, still exactly where she had left it ankle-high across the birch line. She stepped over her own boundary, because tonight her boundary was not the point. Tonight water was the point. At the east house, Marielle met her at the door with a towel and no small talk. Odette was on the couch. Trix was with her. The basement was over Thaddeus's head at the low end. Roz asked how much had come in. 2 inches, rising fast. Contractor's trash was jammed against the lower drain. Shovel and a wet vac were coming up in 5 minutes, Roz confirmed. She asked where the sump pump was. They did not have one. The contractor. Never mind. Roz went down the outside stairs to the basement. Thaddeus was already there, barefoot, rolled up jeans, standing in 3 inches of gray water. His flashlight jammed into the exposed pipe insulation above his head, so it stayed pointing at the trench collapse. He was moving contractor debris, insulation scraps, torn plastic, a bag of broken tile out of the choke point with his hands. Slow, careful, wrong, because you did not clear a jam with your hands when a shovel was coming. Rose did not say so, because Thaddeus, in 3 inches of water in the dark, did not need his younger niece to correct his technique. What he needed was a body next to him and a plan. She sketched the plan out loud. When the shovels came, they cut a diversion trench across the slope. Above the house, 10 feet. So the water split before it hit the wall. That was the priority. The basement pump out was second. Yes. Yes. She turned to Marielle at the top of the stairs. Get every towel you own, she instructed. Roll them at the base of the door to the finished room. Then boil water, not for the basement. For me. I'm going to need coffee in an hour, and so is everybody. Marielle went up the stairs at a run. Ellsworth came down them at the same run with 2 shovels and Roz's wet vacuum. Behind him, Halver. Roz had not called Halver. Ellsworth had, which was a small miracle, which was a thing Roz would think about later, which was right now only useful because it meant they had a 4th pair of hands. Halver took the trench. I took it because he was 66 and had built more trenches than the rest of them combined, and because he saw the slope and did not ask a question about it. He handed 1 shovel to Ellsworth, the other to Thaddeus. He took the 3rd out of Roz's hand, which he had not had a moment before, which he had produced from behind his back, like a man who traveled with spare tools, because he did not trust the tools of a house he was visiting. He gave Roz the wet vac. She knew Nadine's channel. She kept the water going where it should. The 3 of them cut the trench. Because in that moment, in the rain and the wind and the dark, with a woman upstairs on a sofa with a headache and a girl beside her, and a stranger on Roz's own sofa downhill with a fever coming up. The old man with the white beard and the wire glasses became the foreman, and the 2 Halberstam brothers became labor. and Roz became the person who knew where the water went, which was Roz realized as she started the wet vacuum's rasping engine exactly the position Nadine had left her. They worked for 2 hours. Halvor's trench opened up faster than any of them had a right to expect. Ellsworth threw dirt with a kind of hard mechanical fury that suggested he was moving something more than mud. Thaddeus, in bare feet, in 3 inches of water, worked more slowly and more precisely, and Roz watched him from the basement door and thought her quiet uncle was going to have a very bad back tomorrow, and it would be the first honest thing his body had done for this house in a decade. At one point, Ellsworth lost a shoe. It was a leather loafer, the good kind, the kind he wore to lunches with men who had money. The shoe went into the mud at the base of the trench and stayed there heel first upright, as if it had grown out of the ground. Thaddeus started laughing. He laughed in a way that could not be stopped by weather, the way people laugh when they have been holding a scream inside their chest for too many weeks. He leaned on his shovel. He wiped his face with the back of a muddy hand and made the mud on his face worse. Ellsworth stared at the shoe. Then Ellsworth, Halberstam, Elderson laughed too. It was a rusty, half-broken laugh, the laugh of a man who had not laughed at himself in maybe 15 years. It cracked something. In him. In the night. Halvor did not laugh. Halvor told them to leave the shoe. Cut faster. They cut faster. By midnight, the trench was holding. The wet vacuum had brought the basement water down to a shallow layer. The finished room's door was ringed with rolled towels. Marielle had brought coffee twice and boiled soup, once a can of chicken and stars from the pantry, and everyone had eaten it standing up. Winifred appeared at some point. Roz did not know how. Later she would find out that Winifred had walked over from her cottage a half-mile up the road in the rain, with a garden cart full of every flashlight and extra battery pack in her bookstore. Winifred had told the neighbor 2 houses down, and the neighbor had come over with a bow saw and cleared a fallen limb off the county landing so an ambulance could get through if it had to. Which it did not have to, because the woman with the fever downhill in Roz's cottage was under 2 blankets with fluids in her, and the fever was already breaking. Simone came at 1 o'clock, on foot, from nowhere, in a rain poncho over a bathrobe, carrying a stack of clean towels from her supply closet. She did not speak to Roz. She went straight to the east house upstairs and helped Marielle strip Odette's bed of its expensive linen sheets and remake it with plain flannel from the cottage. Because Odette had a headache, and the linen sheets Simone knew from 10 years of cleaning them were too cold when you were sick. At 2 Trix came down the outside stairs into the basement, in her denim jacket and rain boots that were too big. She looked at her father with mud on his face, and her uncle with 1 shoe on, and a strange old man with a white beard running the whole operation, and she declared without any inflection at all that this was the best night of her whole entire life. Halvor barked once. It was a laugh. Roz had never heard Halvor laugh. It was, she realized, a sound that only came out of him when the world briefly stopped disappointing him. Roz put her hand on Trix's shoulder, just for a second. Then she sent the girl back upstairs to bring down another thermos. The rain slackened at 3. By 4 they were done. The trench was holding. The basement was down to a wet floor and a slick of silt, but nothing more coming in. Halvor packed his shovel back into his truck by flashlight and did not accept anyone's thanks. Ellsworth, who had recovered his shoe by then, muddy and unrecoverable, stood in the driveway of his own brother's house, holding the loafer in one hand and looking at Roz like a man who had not, in that whole night, said the word he had needed to say. Rose did not wait for him to say it. She told them all to come down to the cottage. Bring the guests, sleep on the floor, coffee in the morning. She walked away before he could answer. They all came down. All of them. Ellsworth and Marielle and Thaddeus and Odette and Trix, and the 2 rented couples and Halvor and Simone, and even Winifred, who lived a half-mile up the road and did not that night want to walk it alone. 9 people slept in Otto Halberstam's failed inn, 10 counting Roz. She gave the bed to the feverish woman and her husband. She gave the sofa to Odette, who took it silently without a marketing phrase, without a smile. She gave the two dining chairs finely righted, finally down off the sofa where they had been for 8 weeks to Winifred and Simone, who napped upright and did not complain. Marielle and Trix took the rug in front of the cold hearth. Halvor took the front porch on his own insistence with a wool blanket and a mug of coffee that stayed warm in his hands for 2 hours because he did not sleep. The two other guests were tucked in a nest of quilts under the staircase. Ellsworth and Thaddeus sat at the kitchen table. Roz brought them tea. She did not sit down. The two brothers looked at each other over the mugs, like men who had not been in a room alone together without their mother between them in 20 years. Because Nadine had always been in the room. Because Nadine had been the reason the room existed. Because Nadine was gone now, and they were 49 and 54, and they had just spent 4 hours in the mud together, and they had at last run out of ways to avoid each other. Ellsworth spoke first. Quiet. Thad. Thaddeus lifted his eyes. Ellsworth had been carrying something for a while, he offered. He had been quiet about it. It had cost his brother. Thaddeus looked at his hands. Say it. Ellsworth said it. He said the number, the debt number, the consulting business number, the refinance number. He said the name of the man at the bank in Cooperstown who was come November going to want an answer. He said the amount he had counted on from Renfield Development. He said the amount he had quietly been prepared to lose from Roz's inheritance to make the difference. He said all of it in about 4 minutes, in a low voice, without theatrics, because a man who has spent an hour in the mud in one shoe cannot, it turns out, produce theatrics afterward. When he was done, Thaddeus did not answer for a long time. Then Thaddeus told him he could have said it 2 years ago. Ellsworth agreed. His brother would have. He knew. That was why he had not. That was not a reason, Thaddeus corrected. That was an excuse. Ellsworth allowed the correction. Thaddeus rubbed his eyes with the heels of his palms. He looked in the lantern light exactly like his father in a photograph on Nadine's mantle from 1974. He asked what Ellsworth was going to do. Ellsworth answered that he was going to sell his house. He did not say the West House. He did not say the property. He said my house, which was in Ellsworth's mouth a shape of a word Roz had not heard him make before. It was the shape of a man admitting a thing was his and would no longer be. Roz stood at the sink with her hands wrapped around a mug she was not drinking from. She offered, without looking at either of them, that she would help. With the sale. Not with the offer. With the sale. Ellsworth asked what she meant. She meant she would meet the buyers. She would show them where her line was. She would let them decide if they wanted to live next to her on those terms. She would not lie about the terms, and she would not soften them. But she would meet them. Because if the terms scared off a buyer, she did not want Ellsworth thinking later that she had hidden herself. She wanted him to see that people either wanted to live next to a woman who owned her 98-year-old cottage, or they did not. And if they did not, they would keep looking. And if they did, they would let them have his house. She turned around. She looked at Ellsworth. The debt was not hers to solve, she went on. The cottage was. If a buyer who respected her cottage would pay him enough to solve his debt, that was a good weekend for both of them. If not, that was his problem to solve without her land. She loved him. She had not loved him 2 weeks ago. She was telling him the truth. But she was his niece, and Nadine had raised her, and she was telling him now. Ellsworth put his face in his hands. He did not cry exactly. He did the thing men do at his age when the crying has been coming for too long to be a single event, and has instead become a slow leak in the roof of their composure. He sat at the kitchen table with his face in his hands and his shoulders shaking once, and Thaddeus, without saying a word, reached across and put his hand on his older brother's forearm and left it there. Halvor from the porch watched through the window and did not turn his head. Sunrise came at 5:49. By 8, the two rental couples had been picked up by a car service and were on their way to a motel 2 towns south. The feverish woman was well enough to walk to the car under her own power. She thanked Roz twice. She thanked Ellsworth once. She left a $50 bill on the kitchen table under a mug which Roz found later and used on Simone's suggestion to buy a case of instant coffee for the next storm. The East House lost its lower floor and its baseboards and about half of Odette's cabinet fixtures. The West House lost a booking. The cottage lost nothing. The cottage lost nothing. Roz stood at the birch on Saturday morning at 11, coffee in hand, the orange twine still holding, the pines still standing, the channel behind the cottage still running clean, its brown ribbon of storm water pouring cleanly into the lake, exactly where Otto had in 1928 decided it should. Halvor came up beside her. He did not speak for a long time. Then he offered that her grandmother was smiling. Roz did not answer, because the answer to a thing like that is silence. They stood together at the birch for another minute. Then Halvor noted that the West House sign at the fork needed to be reset. The wind had taken it. She had the finish hammer. She knew what to do with it. He walked to his truck. He drove away. Ellsworth listed the West House on the second Monday of September. He priced it fairly. Not high, not low. He wrote the language of the listing himself without Odette's help. Odette had, in the weeks after Kellen quietly stopped assisting on the family property, in the way a woman quietly stops attending a book club she has been dropped from without ever formally being told. The listing said what the West House was. The listing named the residential use conditions on the shore path. The listing did not describe the cottage. The first 3 viewings did not turn into offers. The first viewers wanted the pines removed. Roz declined from the porch of her cottage without leaving the porch. They did not make an offer. The second viewers wanted permission to hold weddings in the summer. Roz declined from the birch in a t-shirt with dirt on her hands from replanting a boundary marker. They did not make an offer. The third viewers wanted the residential conditions relaxed to allow for after-hours guests. Roz declined from her kitchen with the door held open a foot and a mug of coffee in her hand. They did not make an offer. Ellsworth did not, after any of these, call Roz to yell. He called her once to ask if she wanted to have coffee. She agreed. They had coffee at a diner in town on a Wednesday. Neither of them mentioned the West House. Ellsworth asked her about her botany research. He asked with the awkward carefulness of a man who did not know the vocabulary and was not going to fake it. Roz answered plainly. She told him about pea-seed viability and about the Cornell Annex and about her supervisor's stubborn refusal to switch to a better storage protocol. Ellsworth listened. He nodded in the places where nodding was appropriate. He did not once in the whole 45 minutes try to redirect the conversation to a topic he could win. At the end, he paid the check. He offered quietly that she would be very proud of her. He was aware, he added, that this was not something he was authorized to tell her given the last 6 weeks. He was telling her anyway. Roz did not know how to answer that. She thanked him. She went back to the cottage. The fourth viewers were a pair of retired school teachers, twin sisters, late 60s. They arrived in a small green sedan and walked the property in matching windbreakers, and they asked without needing to be prompted whether the pines were staying. Roz was on the shore path when they came down. The taller sister asked whose choice the pines were. Mine, Roz answered, and she would like them to stay. They were staying. The shorter sister nodded once satisfied. She looked past Roz at the low-arched roof of the cottage and observed that it was the most peculiar building she had ever seen on a lake. She wanted to know if there was a story to it. Roz told her. She told her about Otto in Norway and the fishing sheds and the failed inn. She told her about Nadine. She did not tell her about the notebooks. Some things were not for strangers on the first meeting. The taller sister allowed that they would like to live next to somebody who had told them that story, please. They made an offer that afternoon. It was 5% below asking. It was inside the number Ellsworth needed to cover the bank in Cooperstown. Not by much, but by enough. Ellsworth signed at the closing on a Friday in late October. He came down to the cottage that same evening, alone, without Odette. He brought a bottle of the wine he had explained for 4 minutes at the salmon dinner which had gone unopened all summer. He set it on Roz's kitchen table. He did not say anything sentimental, because Ellsworth did not have a vocabulary for sentimental. What Ellsworth had was a set of small, precise gestures, and this was one of them. He offered her a key. To what? The West House, he answered. He knew it was not his anymore. The Ashby sisters had given him a copy at closing, in case something happened when they were away in the winter. in case they needed somebody in the neighborhood to check on a pipe. He had thought Roz knew the property, and she was in the neighborhood. Roz held out her hand. He put the key in it, a single brass key on a plain ring. She thanked him. He looked at her a moment. He offered that he had not been a good uncle to her for a long time. He did not know how to become one now. He was willing to try, but he did not know how. Roz looked at him. She looked at the wine on her table. She looked at the key in her hand. He just had she offered. He did not stay for the wine. He said he had to drive back to Cooperstown and he wanted to make it before dark. He left. Roz watched his car go up the drive. She watched the taillights disappear at the fork. Then she went back inside and put the key on a small hook by the caretaker's door. Below Otto's Finnish hammer above Nadine's field gloves. She sat at the kitchen table with the wine, and she did not open it. Because the wine, she understood, was not for tonight. The wine was for Thanksgiving. When Thaddeus and Trix would drive up, and Marielle would drive up separately, and Winifred would walk from her cottage, and Halver would come in his moss-green truck with a silver door, and Simone would sit at the head of the table because Nadine had always said that whoever cleaned up should get the good chair, and the Ashby sisters, if invited, and they would be invited, would bring a pie. The wine was for the first Thanksgiving in the cottage, which was still 5 weeks away, which was enough time to plan for. Thaddeus came alone to the cottage in the last week of October. He came without borrowing anything. He came without a tool or a ladder or a shovel. He came in the dark of a Tuesday evening at 7 o'clock, and he sat on the porch step without knocking, and he waited until Roz noticed him through the window and opened the door. She brought a chair out for him. He shook his head. She sat on the step beside him instead. The lake was black under a black sky. The moon had not risen yet. The Ashby sisters' window was warm gold up the hill and to the west. The East house empty tonight because Odette had gone to visit her sister in Buffalo and Thaddeus had apparently chosen not to sleep there alone was dark. He offered it into the dark without looking at her. He had been quiet for a long time. Rose did not answer, because he did not need her to. He had been quiet when Ellsworth spoke because his brother always spoke first. And that had been, he had told himself for 30 years that it was fine, that it was how brothers worked. The older one talked and the younger one waited his turn. Except his turn had never come. Because he had not taken it. Because he had not known how to take it. And Roz was 24 years old. And she had taken her turn the first day of the meeting. She did not answer. He did not know how to learn what she had learned, he continued. He was 49 years old. He had a daughter who was watching him. He did not want her to watch her father go quiet for the rest of his life. Roz offered that Trix was not watching him go quiet. She was watching him become someone else. Slowly. Thaddeus made a small sound. Not a laugh, not a sob, something in between. A sound of a man who had needed to be told a thing by someone younger than his daughter and had not until this moment known he was allowed to be. Roz got up. She went inside. She came back out with a notebook. It was a composition notebook, black speckled cover, wide ruled. A small white sticker on the spine that read 1996 in Nadine's flat handwriting. She gave it to Thaddeus. He held it in his lap. He looked at it. He asked what it was, the year he had finished college. She had written about him in it. Not every day, but sometimes. Thaddeus opened the notebook. He held the flashlight from his coat pocket over the pages and he read. Roz did not read over his shoulder. She sat beside him and she watched the black water of the lake, and she gave him the privacy of his own mother's handwriting. He read for a long time. Then he closed the notebook. He held it against his chest. He offered low that there was a paragraph in July. Nadine had written that she had never known what he wanted, that she had been trying to guess his whole life and had always guessed wrong, that she was sorry. Roz observed that Nadine had written that in 1996. Yes, that she had never given it to him. No, that she had given it to Roz, to give to him, this year. Thaddeus put his face in his hands. He cried the way a man cries at 49 when he has been holding a thing since he was 19. Rose sat beside him on the porch step of a cottage her great-grandfather had built, and her grandmother had lived in, and she now lived in. And she did not put her arm around him, and she did not shush him, and she did not say a thing at all. Because sometimes the kindest thing you can do for a person is hand him his mother's handwriting and sit next to him while he learns to breathe again. The second Friday of November brought the first real cold. Rose had spent the week preparing for Thanksgiving, which meant in practice that she had scrubbed the arched roof room upstairs and moved a folding table down from the shed and asked Halvor to help her lengthen it with two planks laid across sawhorses in the yard. Halvor had objected that you could not eat outdoors in November. Roz had told him to watch her. He had lengthened the table anyway. By 6 on that Friday evening, the whole yard was set. Not for Thanksgiving. That was still 2 weeks off. For a smaller thing. For a soup. For the first of what Roz had already decided without telling anyone was going to be a weekly thing. Because Nadine had lived 36 years in this cottage and had eaten most of those years alone at her kitchen table. And Roz had inherited the cottage. And Roz had decided, sitting on the porch step the night Thaddeus had cried into his mother's handwriting, that she was going to inherit the cottage in a way that was hers, which meant not eating alone. She had made a big pot of vegetable soup. She had made cornbread from Winifred's recipe. She had put out a jug of cider on the porch rail because Halvor liked cider and Halvor did not know she knew. They came in 2s and 3s. Winifred first with a jar of pickled onions and a paperback book she pressed into Roz's hand at the door. Simone second with nothing at all and a completely unapologetic expression, and the specific competence of a woman who had known she would be needed for dishes and had come to do them. Halvor third in his knit cap with a small folding chair under his arm, because Roz's chairs, in his professional opinion, were traps made of wood. He set the folding chair down next to Roz's own chair without asking. Trix came with Marielle. Marielle had in the 2 months since Kellen started coming to the lake without Ellsworth. Not against him, just separately, as if she were remembering how to have her own weekends. She brought a bottle of apple wine that turned out to be very good. Marielle had spent Roz noticed the drive up, scraping the last of a summer's tension out of her shoulders. She rolled them once deliberately when she stepped out of the car and did not roll them again. Thaddeus came alone. Odette did not come. Nobody commented on it. Odette was going through what Odette was going through, and the invitation stood, and that was as much as needed to be said. The Ashby sisters, Delphine and Corabelle, came late apologetically with a loaf of bakery bread and a story about their car battery. They were absorbed into the yard by Simone within 30 seconds and were passing bowls before they had removed their coats. Ellsworth did not come. But he had said when Roz had called him a week earlier to invite him with a wooden formality he had not been able to shake yet, that he might drive up for a little while. He would see, he would try. Roz had told him not to feel pressure. The soup kept. And so at 7:12 on the second Friday of November, when Roz was ladling soup into a bowl for Delphine, Ashby headlights came slow down the drive from the county landing. A dark sedan, Cooperstown plates. It stopped at the top of the gravel pad. The engine died. The driver's door opened, and Ellsworth Halberstam got out. He did not come down the path immediately. He stood in the gravel with his hands in his coat pockets. He looked at the yard, at the long table under the pines, at Halvor and Simone and Winifred and Marielle and Thaddeus and Trix, and the 2 school teachers who had bought his house. At Roz in her grandmother's canvas apron holding a ladle. Roz caught his eye across the yard. She did not wave him down. She did not call out. She did not do the warm thing that would have made it easy for him to descend on the smooth track of a family greeting. She did something quieter. She filled a bowl of soup. She walked it up the path. She met him at the edge of the gravel. She put the bowl in his hands. He looked at the bowl. He did not know where to sit. She offered him the porch step. If he wanted, it was a good step. He sat on the porch step. Ate the soup with a spoon Winifred had brought over. He ate it slowly. Nobody at the table interrupted him. Nobody stared. Halvor did not turn his head. Trix passed him a slice of cornbread from 10 feet away without comment. Rose went back to the table. She sat next to Halvor. She picked up her own bowl. She looked for a moment at the roof of Otto's cottage behind her, its half-round window warm with lantern light, its cedar shingles silver in the last blue dusk. She looked at the birch at the far edge of the yard where the orange twine had weeks ago been replaced by 4 small cedar stakes she had cut herself with Halvor watching. She looked at the shore path and the fork in the old West House marker. Otto had burned in 1958, remounted crookedly above her door because she preferred it crooked. She looked at all the people around the table. She thought that this was not blood. She thought that some of it was, and most of it was not, and it did not matter. She thought, Nan, you saw this before I did. Winifred tapped a spoon against her bowl, not for silence, for attention. She wanted to say one thing she offered before the soup got cold. Then she wanted to be quiet and eat. Everyone looked at her. Nadine Halberstam had been her best friend for 41 years, Winifred announced, and she had been a very difficult woman. She had not suffered fools. She had not thrown compliments around. She had raised 3 children and buried one, and raised her granddaughter and buried her husband, and lived at the end in a cottage that most of her family had thought was beneath her. And she had been right about the cottage, and she had been right about her granddaughter, and she was tonight extremely pleased with all of them, including the one of them who was late. Ellsworth on the porch step looked up. Winifred did not look at him. She raised her spoon. Everyone raised their spoons. Nobody said a toast. There was no need for a toast. The raised spoons were the toast. They ate. The soup was hot, and it had too much pepper because Halvor had grabbed the peppermill on the walk to the table and had unauthorized added more. Marielle laughed at something Trix said, a real laugh, the first one Roz had heard from her all year, rough at the edges from not being used. Simone corrected Winifred's pronunciation of a word in the paperback title. Delphine Ashby asked, without any preamble, whether Roz would consider hosting a book club at the cottage over the winter. And Winifred, before Roz could answer, settled the matter. Roz would, but only if the books were good, and Winifred would be curating. Thaddeus caught Roz's eye across the table. He smiled. He was still tired. He was going to be tired for a while. But he was not quiet tonight. He was tonight at a table where his mother's absence was at last the shape of her presence. Halvor, without looking at Roz, murmured low, asking if she was planning to do this every Friday from now on. Roz kept her eyes on her bowl. That was the plan. Fine. Next week he would bring the bread. He did not bake. How did he correct it? He had been doing it in secret since his wife died. Nobody knew. Do not tell anyone. Halvor. What? He was going to have to tell everybody eventually. He grunted. He did not disagree. The stars came out over the black water. The loon called once from the far shore and did not call again. Trix took a video of Roz reading at the table, one line from Notebook 11, the last thing Nadine had written in the world 3 days before she died. Trix would keep the video on her phone for the rest of her life. She would not show it to anyone until she was 32 years old, and she would show it then to her own daughter on a night that mattered. The cottage stood behind them, small, strange, 98 years old, boat hole roof, half-round window, copper chimney turned green with weather. Otto's failed inn, Nadine's home, Rosalind's now. The pencil line held.